Hello everyone, I'm Wave, and today I'm going to be talking about Infinite Stratos, Ignition Hearts, which is a visual novel that I was actually quite surprised by in seeing how it provides story through multiple character perspectives. It is quite a lighthearted game for most of its runtime, but I was quite surprised at how serious toned it got in various moments throughout its runtime, and its attempts at deconstructing the harem genre as a whole. Anyways, let's get into it. So Infinite Stratos, Ignition Hearts. This is a first out of two PS3 visual novel games using the Infinite Stratos IP, which is a pretty popular harem series from quite a while back, and as such it does very much play into what you would expect for a visual novel. There is a total of 7 potential routes that you can go on to, including common route as well, and it's actually quite a lengthy game. I will say, despite just how basic the premise of the game might look at its core, just from the outside, I was surprised with how Infinite Stratos is very layered when it comes to the attention to detail that came within both its gameplay and also just its actual storytelling. Infinite Stratos Ignition Hearts does have a gameplay system that works throughout the common route that will then be utilized later to dictate which heroine route you end up on once you progress through the story. I have talked about the gameplay in its own separate video alongside 2 other games and kind of comparing and contrasting the overall utilization of gameplay in visual novels, but I do think I can still talk about it a bit in this video as well, as I feel like it is quite important to how it affects your overall play experience. It utilizes what is called the ignition gauge, which is a meter that feels that there's 2 different meters for each of the 7 heroines that are both a positive and a negative. The positive gauge carries over and is used as the deciding factor for which girl you're going to end up on for any of the given routes, but then the negative gauge is used as a deterrent for you to, in a style, the Infinite Stratos IP, to not be the dense male protagonist that makes all the decisions that are wrong and pisses off the various girls. And if you are to make too many of the negative decisions throughout any given day, you are then at the end of the day cycle going to be receiving a quote-unquote bad ending from said girl that takes away a point that you would have had to go see a girl of your choice, and instead are now in a scene that is ticking down a counter where you can only have 4 bad endings in any one playthrough before you get a bad ending or game over in general, and then need to start over from the beginning with common route. It's a very interwoven mechanic that I think is relatively fleshed out. It's not something that is just kind of brought up towards the start of the game and is just forgotten about. It is something that stays throughout the playthrough all the way up until the very end of common route. You're going to constantly get different decisions, and you have to constantly be able to decide what is the best choice. And balancing, once you get further into the game, there are multiple choices that give both a positive and a negative, and you have to kind of balance, make sure that you are not going to be ticking off any one girl. It is very susceptible to save scumming because you can just save, reload, and go through all of the typically 3 choices until you get to the choice that you're the most happy with, the most content with. But I think in a way, just the way that it's used is quite unique. It is quite fleshed out, and I do appreciate it. It's not something that really takes you out of the visual novel experience of reading. It is something that is very baked into the core of the game, and I appreciate it. But one thing I do think is worth mentioning, because of how much it affects the story, is that throughout Common Route, there will come a point where there is a almost like fake out where you're expecting to see the end of Common Route, or like a bad ending to where you're expecting to see credits roll, and there's a fake out that ends up continuing forth past what you were expecting to see with Common Route, and the main character ends up coming down with amnesia, and that ends up impacting how the story progresses and how the tone throughout the story does end up shifting. It becomes a lot more serious and kind of allows for the harem trope of all the girls kind of vying for the main player's attention to start to simmer down, and you focus in on one particular girl. It does come about with a pretty solid attempt to almost deconstruct the harem genre, and we get asked a lot of questions as to whether, is it right to be, the player character questions. Was I like a terrible person? How come all these girls are like in love with me? Have I been cheating on all of these girls? What kind of like terrible person am I? I don't really deserve the amount of respect that people seem to give to me. And goes further into, once we get into the actual routes for all of the heroines, because depending on which heroine you're on, the results may vary. But for the main 5 heroines, being Hoki, Charlotte, Laura, Rin, and Cecilia, all 5 of those routes have a very heavy emphasis on you are no longer playing as the male protagonist. You are now seeing the story through that girl's eyes instead. And in some routes, I was actually quite surprised and was experiencing one of the most unique attempts at, one of the most unique ways of portraying story. It's not exactly something that's particularly new if you're somebody that plays like a lot of RPGs. Seeing the story through multiple different character perspectives isn't exactly something that is groundbreaking, but I think from the visual novels that I've played so far, I haven't seen it utilized in a scope that has been that well like adapted or that fleshed out. So to be able to have just an entire route where you're playing as the girl now and seeing the main character as somebody that you're not playing as anymore, making multiple choices, seeing the in-depth like thoughts of the girl that you personally during Common Route made choices to end up being with, and then also being able to see that like girl versus girl dynamic of being a harem genre, having almost kind of like rivals but also friends. And there are multiple points throughout any of the routes where you kind of get to see a more like broader scope of taking a step back from the romantic side of things and being able to kind of have just very like down to earth, very serious, and very like still friendly but also like rival-esque kind of conversations with the other girls that you are not playing as. Infinite Stratos, I was actually quite surprised in its length as well. It's a console game, so I wasn't expecting it to be anything more than maybe like 20 or so hours. I ended up playing all the way up until 40 hours. It could be how the way I've read it, in that wasn't able to use Textractor. I ended up having to use Sugoi Translator, which is a little slower because it has to grab the text manually from imaging rather than from the game's direct like files, but I was actually quite surprised at the overall length of Infinite Stratos, the amount of depth when it came to story, and how it interweaves gameplay throughout. There are constant choices, and even when you are on the routes, the choices feel very intriguing. It no longer affects the actual ignition boost or gauge, but there are still multitudes of choices, and it is quite intriguing and unique in how, when I was playing Infinite Stratos Ignition Hearts, it just felt like a very different style game than what I'm usually used to playing. Infinite Stratos Ignition Hearts is quite a hard game to get into. It is a PlayStation 3 title. It actually looks quite good considering its age at this point, but I think if you're somebody that does not read Japanese, it's quite difficult to kind of get it set up to where you're going to be able to read it. I did enjoy my time with it though, and if you are able to kind of figure it out and get through and are willing to sit down for maybe a little bit longer than what you might be expecting, I think you're going to have a fun time reading Infinite Stratos Ignition Hearts, especially if you are a fan of the IP Infinite Stratos. It definitely did boost my overall opinion on the game. I had a lot of fun reading it. Anyways, those are my thoughts on what I found to be one of the more unique romance visual novels that I read, utilizing both a very well-rounded, interwoven gameplay system and then also a very unique approach to the harem genre and how it shows routes. So yes, those have been my thoughts on Infinite Stratos Ignition Hearts. Thank you guys for watching. I've been Wave, and I will see you next time.